I think if there were a ground invasion of Rafah, the consequences would be truly apocalyptic.
Did that have a sort of emotional power that you felt connected with people at the United Nations?
Yeah, certainly at the United Nations. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that some of the people hearing these stories were in tears. I had pictures of them, which I could show to all the people we met, both the United Nations and Congress, the Senate, and of course the Biden administration, all the different departments. So that was very powerful. I have been in despair at the reluctance of our government, our opposition, the US government to push earlier for a ceasefire. Yes, I still am hopeful that things will stop and that there will be a Gaza left to rebuild.
This is Musa Qureshi from the Watermelon Reports. We welcome back Professor Nick Maynard, a surgeon from Oxford and former director of cancer services there. Professor Maynard, thank you for this second section of the interview where we're going to talk about your recent experiences in the United States. And so let's discuss first your meetings with the United Nations. As you mentioned, you went there with senior medics from MedGlobal and MSF. You're not a politician. You're a top surgeon, but I assume you've got limited experience of politics. You must have had some sort of political strategy when you went in there. When you met people at the United Nations, did you decide to focus, for instance, on the UN Secretary General's office or on friendly member states like Ireland, or were you talking to, for instance, countries which are very supportive of Israel? What was your strategy going in?
A mixture of all of what you've described. So you're absolutely right. I'm not a politician, so I think all the doctors needed a lot of guidance. One of the other doctors, a US doctor, who was a wonderful chap, has actually done a lot more of this than I have, particularly with the US government. So he was quite experienced at doing that. But we took a lot of advice from Avaz and another organization, Crisis Action, who helped organize this and had a lot more political experience than I had and the other doctors. So we had a lot of guidance. From them we discussed strategy at length before the meetings, but the main thrust of the meetings was not politics. It was clearly us providing witness testimony to what we have seen on the ground. So it was the main thrust of it was doctors' experiences, but we were guided with the political strategy to really ensure our message was heard as loudly as possible.
So it sounds like, obviously, we know the United Nations has huge amounts of data coming in from Gaza. They have a huge presence there with UNRWA. And your role was to really give them a personal account of the human story of suffering that you witnessed. There are projections that we could see something like 200,000 deaths in an escalation scenario. For instance, if Israel sends ground forces into Rafah, we're talking 200,000 deaths we're talking about 10% of Gaza's population. Just to put in context, that's the equivalent of 6.7 million deaths in the United Kingdom or 30 million deaths in the United States. What will it look like on the ground in terms of healthcare infrastructure in Gaza if that happens?
We're running out of words to describe how awful the situation is there. I've been using the word catastrophic. We all have for weeks now, and it'll be beyond that. It'll be apocalyptic. The healthcare infrastructure has been almost completely destroyed. There's a lot of talk about functioning hospitals, partly functioning hospitals, and we're told there are, 2 or 3 functioning hospitals, 12 partly functioning hospitals. I'm not sure that really is an accurate way to describe this. I would argue that not a single hospital is functioning properly at all. Even Al-Aqsa Hospital, when I was there, or the European Hospital at the time I was in Gaza, or Nasser Hospital before it was overtaken by ground forces, these were all described as functioning hospitals, but they weren't functioning. They couldn't cope with the amount of trauma coming in, let alone the non-traumatic causes for attending a hospital, the communicable diseases, the non-communicable diseases. So none of them are functioning properly at all. And now I would argue that there's probably only 2 or 3 at the most which are partly functioning. And I think if there were a ground invasion of Rafah, the consequences would be truly apocalyptic. Rafah is a small city, small town. It normally has a population of just over 200,000. There's now well over 1 million people in Rafah or the surrounding part of the town. There are 3 hospitals in Rafah. There's a governmental hospital which has 60 beds. Which is called Al Najjar Hospital. They've increased the number of beds to about 100, but that's with overcrowding. There's a small private hospital called the Kuwaiti Hospital, which has 15 beds. They've increased to about 30. And there's an MSF hospital, which a field hospital with, I think, about 80. So the healthcare system has not got anything like the number of beds to cope with what's going on at the moment. If there were a ground invasion in Rafah, it would be apocalyptic.
In many large organizations like the United Nations, you have a lot of bureaucracy and what we call paralysis by analysis. Now, obviously, the United Nations has huge amounts of data coming in, but clearly what's needed here is some urgent action. Were you able to communicate a sense of urgency to the United Nations, for instance, the Secretary General's office? And do you think they have a plan to deal with what's about to unfold in Gaza as famine and infectious diseases extend throughout the civilian population?
So we did have the opportunity to convey the severity of what we were seeing on the ground, and we're very clear that that was received appropriately. We did meet many member states. We met the E10 collectively. We met some of the permanent members as well, and I left those meetings. We all left those meetings. No doubt they'd heard our message and they took on board what we talked about. We'd decided as part of our strategy what we wanted to emphasize. And the 4 doctors talked about some of the appalling clinical things we've seen, which I've shared my stories with you today. And my colleagues had similar stories. But we also talked at length about problems with the deconfliction process, which is not working and therefore is putting visiting foreign doctors and healthcare workers at huge personal risk in Gaza. And we talked at great length about the problems with aid getting in, and more importantly, the problems with aid not being distributed. And we talked at length about malnutrition and the imminent famine in the north of Gaza. So those messages, I think, we absolutely hit home. We did speak to people who were perhaps less supportive of pushing for a ceasefire than others, and I think the message clearly did get home. Now, whether that's translated into really a change in direction, of course, it would be naive to think we're going to have a huge impact. But the member states who were very supportive of an immediate ceasefire were very grateful for the evidence we gave them, with which they could use in their further discussions. They were determined to push forward that agenda with a lot of the evidence that we gave them.
I just wonder if you feel that going behind all the statistics and actually giving personal testimony of what you had witnessed, did that have a sort of emotional power that you felt connected with people at the United Nations?
Certainly at the United Nations. I mean, it's no exaggeration to say that some of the people hearing these stories were in tears, which we saw. And indeed, when we got to DC and spoke to many of the senators and congressmen, it was very clear that they wanted to hear these stories. They didn't want to hear it, but they needed to hear those stories, and they appreciated the strength of those really, really emotional stories. So And indeed, we heard our stories being relayed in Congress in debates subsequent to our meetings. So they clearly did hit home, and I think the people we met needed and wanted to hear those stories so they could use those stories in their debates and introduce that raw emotion to help to make people understand what is really going on.
We do hide behind statistics, and actually war is a horrific personal experience. It's not just about numbers, it's about the effect on lives. And often politicians who are very remote from the wars that they are often authorizing don't actually see the real consequences of their decisions. So I think that was definitely a very effective and important strategy. Arguably, the United States is the only effective mechanism for influencing Israel to cease its assault on Gaza. So I'd like to turn to perhaps the most important part of your recent mission, which was your meetings with political leaders, senators, and members of the House of Representatives. Did you have a different mindset and strategy for these meetings?
So with the senators and the congressmen, it was a very similar strategy. It was predominantly about the doctors giving testimony and talking about these emotional cases and focusing on the issues that we feel need urgent attention, and perhaps those issues which we felt that they might be able to help with. So, for example, the problems with deconfliction. It's a very tangible problem that actually could be fixed. I wouldn't say easily, but quickly. The Israeli Defense Force have, in previous wars, had a very clear and robust deconfliction policy, which they have upheld. So they've done it before, they're just not doing it now. So there needs to be much better communication between COGAT, which is the liaison part of the government that we deal with, and the Israeli Defense Force, the military. That where the communication's breaking down, why it's breaking down, I don't know. But they've demonstrated very clearly they've done it in previous wars, so they can do it now. So we wanted to highlight that because that feels it's something that, with appropriate pressure from the US administration, that's something that could be quickly fixed. Any humanitarian workers going into Gaza at the moment under the WHO emergency medical team mechanism has to be approved. Each team and each individual has to be approved by the Israeli Defense Force. And at the moment, they're not letting in any dual nationals, by which I mean dual US Palestinian or UK Palestinian nationals, some of whom are wonderful doctors and nurses who would provide great value because of their links to Palestine. And again, it seems a pretty easy, quick fix to to persuade them to let those individuals in. So we pushed on that matter.
So, Professor Maynard, Dr. Salul, who was from Med Global and was part of your delegation, informed the press at the United Nations that he had already met with several United States senators, including Senator Durbin, Senator Duckworth, Senator Warren, and Senator Von Hollen. He also told the press that your group had scheduled meetings with Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Von Hollen again. How did those meetings go? Are you able to give us any idea of the mood in those meetings and anything constructive that happened?
Yeah, they went extremely well. They are both clearly individuals who are very supportive of pushing for a ceasefire, if only belatedly, and are very concerned about the blockade of aid distribution within Gaza. Particularly, they're concerned about the blockade of US aid going into and being distributed in Gaza, and the ongoing provision of arms to Israel. So they were, we were all singing from the same hymn sheet, but they welcomed the evidence we could give them to enable them to push that agenda. And indeed, the Bernie Sanders was talking in Congress only 3 hours after our meeting, and used a lot of the evidence that we had given him.
So that's really interesting, Professor Maynard, that politicians were going into meetings with you, coming out of those meetings, and then speaking publicly about what you had experienced. All of these senators that we've discussed so far from the Democrats Party, but Dr. Salul said something very interesting at the United Nations press conference. He said, we're looking to meet with Republican senators because I think that's more important at this point. Can you explain anything about the thinking of your group regarding why you wanted to reach out to Republican senators as well as Democrat senators? And did you have any success with that?
So we met with senators who were very supportive, had similar views to us, and I guess our aim there was to give them evidence to help with that agenda, as I've described. We were very keen to meet with some Republican senators, but we weren't able to do so because they didn't respond to our requests. We were hoping to meet up with them in order to provide testimony as to what we are seeing, I guess with the hope of persuading them that they needed to push for a ceasefire and so forth. But we weren't able to meet with any Republican senators, which was disappointing. There's a group of Republican doctors within the Senate who we were keen to meet with, but again, we weren't able to do so.
That's very unfortunate to hear. Did you get a sense that there's a meaningful shift in the American political class with regards to the Israel-Palestine conflict? For instance, you mentioned the question of arms, and it's often been remarked that America is giving aid or sending aid to the Palestinian people, but it's also basically supplying the war machine that Israel is operating at the moment. Did you feel that there's a shift in the way the American political class are thinking?
Yes, I did. I mean, I guess the caveat I need to introduce is that we weren't meeting the actual decision makers. Clearly, we were meeting either people with a strong position to campaign and to talk in Congress, or we were meeting officials, albeit very senior officials, advisors, staff members in the administration, who had the very, very clear ear of the decision makers. So in terms of the people we met with, we got the very, very clear indication that there is a change in thinking, which we welcomed hugely. Now, whether that translates into changes on behalf of the decision makers, who knows? But at the level we were meeting people, there is a very clear understanding of the issues that we raised, and we got the very clear impression that a very clear agenda to try and change things at that level.
Okay, well, that's very positive news. Moving on specifically to the White House and the United States administration, who did you meet from the White House? And did you get a sense of their purpose? Why do you think they agreed to meet you?
I'm not sure I know why they agreed. I hope they agreed to meet us because they felt that we would provide valuable evidence to help inform the advice they were giving and the decision making. We met senior officials from the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, and these were private meetings, so I can't name individuals, but people who were senior advisors, senior staff members, and we had an excellent reception. We had been warned beforehand that we may not get the warm reception that we had from senators and the UN and congressmen, but in fact we were really encouraged by the reception and the very clear messaging from those people that they really understood the issues we were raising and were working very, very hard to steer the agenda in a much clearer direction that in line with what we've been talking about. Similarly, when we met senior advisors and staff members from the National Security Council and similarly when we met the equivalent people in the Vice President's office. So we were very encouraged by the reception we got and the feedback we got from them. Our last meeting, before we finished our week, was with Samantha Powers, who's the administrator who leads US Agency for International Development. And she has gone public in talking about meeting us. So hence I can share the name and just talk about what we discussed. And that to me was probably the single most useful and important meeting we had. And it was extremely encouraging. She absolutely took on board what we said. She agreed to take various things further forward and agreed to an ongoing conversation between us and her office. So that was extremely encouraging.
My most vivid recollections from both the Healthcare Workers for Palestine talk you gave after returning from Gaza and the United Nations press conference a few days ago were your personal testimonies. For instance, Dr. Sahlul from Med Global focused on the tragic deaths of Hiyam, a 7-year-old girl who sustained terrible burns injuries, and Mohammed Khalil, a 12-year-old boy who sustained devastating shrapnel wounds to his abdomen. Did you have the opportunity to share these testimonies with officials from the White House, as well as, for instance, Senator Bernie Sanders? And do you think they had any impact on people who are often making quite cold, hard political decisions in the interests of the American state?
Yeah, we did. We again, this was part of our strategy. So I, for example, and Zahir Salul and Thea Ahmed and Amber Alayan, so all 4 doctors gave very clear evidence about the cases they'd seen, and Zahir Salul and myself, we both took large photographs of the patient of some of the clinical situations. We took laminated copies of our pictures and distributed them out to the officials. So, for example, I have a picture which I had laminated of the emergency room in Al-Aqsa Hospital with the case I described, the 6-year-old boy, with the open chest wound, the 8-year-old boy lying on the ground with a terminal head injury, and the girl with a displaced leg. So I had pictures of them, which I could show to all the people we met, both the United Nations and Congress, the Senate, and of course the Biden administration, all the different departments. So that was very powerful. And Dr. Salul had a video of a young girl with appalling injuries who had acute, PTSD. Well, it wasn't PTSD because she's still going through it. It's an acute stress disorder, and that was very powerful. So I think all these images were very powerful and were a clear part of our strategy.
It's obviously too soon to evaluate the outcome of your latest mission to the United Nations and to the US political class, but 6 months into this devastating conflict, do you now feel closer to hope or to despair? And what's your plan to move forwards?
I don't know how to answer that in terms of hope or despair. I think all of us involved in Gaza have this intrinsic, strong hope that things must get better, because I think without that, you'd be close to giving up, frankly. None of us expected in October that we'd still be here nearly 6 months later, witnessing the devastation we're seeing. I have been in despair at the reluctance of our government, our opposition, the US government, to push earlier for a ceasefire and to stop this. And I firmly believe that the US administration in particular has the ability to stop this. They have sufficient leverage with the Israeli government to stop this. and they have chosen not to do so. So I have been in despair, as you will have been, as all of us will have been, at the failure of the UK and the Western governments to use that leverage. But I have always hoped that things will settle. And having had these extensive meetings in the US, I am a little bit more hopeful. I mean, one can despair at the fact it's taken this long, and I hope we will see some changes. But I am intrinsically an optimistic person, and I think you have to be that when it comes to Gaza. So yes, I still am hopeful that things will stop and that there will be a Gaza left to rebuild.
Well, Professor Maynard, it's been a great pleasure and hugely informative to host you on the Watermelon Reports to discuss the human stories you've witnessed and the unfolding healthcare catastrophe in Gaza. Thank you so
very
much,
Musa, for listening to me. I've greatly enjoyed it.